transition can be a teacher or it can take you out. You can either like walk into bitterness, rejection, fear, anger, or you can channel those things and go into the presence of God and allow him to cause you to become more like Christ.
Hey there, you're listening to the Girls Talking Life podcast, and I'm your host, Johanna. If you're like me, you love time with friends. I always leave feeling encouraged, inspired to try something different, or I've learned something new. So why not continue to grow even when we can't be with our girlfriends? We're not made to do life on our own. So in each episode of this show, I'll bring you a girl and her story to give you refreshing ideas to stir your soul. Let's walk this road together. Are you ready to talk life? Hello, friend. You are listening to episode number 135. If you're listening in real time, my birthday is in 2 weeks. As a gift to me, would you be willing to support the show by leaving a rating or a review? Here's what one sweet listener had to say about Girls Talking Life. I love this podcast. The content has been completely relatable and applicable for me, including some of the more challenging topics. I'm always left feeling encouraged, strengthened in my faith, and a bit wiser from the knowledge shared by all the remarkable guests that are featured. Highly recommend. Thank you, Angie RM. Those kind words are super encouraging to me and also help put this podcast in front of more listeners. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, would you consider leaving a review or a 5-star rating? Scroll to the bottom of the show and there it is. It's quick and easy. And it would be such a gift to me. Are you going through a big change right now? Or maybe lots of little ones? Change is inevitable, and even good change can be hard. I'll be the first to admit that I am not always great with change. I need a long runway to process and prepare, and I don't always welcome it with open arms, which is why I am so glad for my guest today. Author Andi Andrew joins me to chat about how we show up in the midst of the changes that we face, how it's okay to grieve the losses, show gratitude for what's next, and how through the transition we can grow to be more like Christ. Andi is the host of the Coffee with Andi podcast and the author of 4 books, including She is Free, Fake or Follower, and Friendship, It's Complicated. Andi is a heartfelt preacher who loves to see the reality of the gospel worked out in our everyday lives. This week, one lucky email subscriber will win a copy of Andi's book, Braving Change. So if you don't already get the GTL newsletter, now is the time to get signed up. Find the link in the show notes. Here's our conversation. Hey, Andi, thank you so much for coming on Girls Talking Life.
Thank you for having me. So glad to be with you today.
You are the author of several books, but your latest is called Braving Change. Release the past, welcome growth, and trust where God is leading you. Andi, those are all hard things, or they have the potential to be.
Yes, they do.
Talk to me a little bit about your recent change story, and then also why you came to write a book about this.
Yes, I would love to. So I'll tell you our recent change story, but really the conception of this book started maybe 6 or 7 years ago, but we'll start with the most recent change, which was my husband and I had planted a church in New York City in 2010, pastored it for 12 years, and planted multiple campuses, communities, led together, raised our 4 kids in the heart of the city, and in 2018 started to feel a shift, but it wasn't time yet. My husband had come home from this beautiful retreat that he was invited on, which is so funny because he's a city guy, and invited onto this outdoor retreat. And he's like, why would I go on this? And I was like, I don't know, maybe because Pastor Greg asked you to go. So just go sit at a table and glean from him. And my husband came home and his eyes were clear. And it was like my husband came home and I didn't even know he was missing. And this whole shift took place in him where he found joy again. And he started doing hobbies again. But in that moment when he walked in the room, it was like I saw this movie trailer play out in front of me, and we were packing up boxes. We were transitioning the church. My husband was sitting around these smaller tables pastoring pastors. And I was like, oh, I said to my husband, I was like, we're done pastoring the church. And he kind of looked at me like, no, we're not. We weren't in agreement. We weren't in cohesion, at that time. And so I was like, oh, okay, well, like I just had to settle. Maybe that wasn't a word. Maybe I saw or felt wrongly. And so fast forward, pastoring through some of the most difficult leadership years of our life, New York City, 2020, 2021.
Yeah.
And we actually, in the middle of 2020, had this amazing couple come in to lead with us, which we're like, why do you want to move to New York right now? This is not the best move. But what we realized is once they got there, they were the people for the job. And it was like something locked and loaded in my husband's heart. He'd already been building something called the Barnabas Network, which is my husband's name is Paul. And he felt like the Lord said to him, it's time for you to stop being a Paul and become a Barnabas. And so we knew we needed to be obedient in that season, transition the church to our friends, and then moved to Charleston, South Carolina. And now we're a part of Seacoast Church, which Pastor Greg, who invited Paul on this first retreat to, he founded the church. Now his son and daughter-in-law pastor the church. But now Pastor Greg oversees something called the Pastors Collective, which is pastoring and caring for leaders. And guess who works for him? My husband does. So, but all within that was a lot of wild change. And so it felt like the right time to write the book that I felt like pastoring through New York City and many other changes that had taken place in life, where the Lord is like, now is a time where you actually can give wisdom to people, whereas before you weren't there yet. So this was kind of the trigger point to start to write the book. So that was the most recent change.
So that all sounds really great when you say it, looking back, like all the pieces have fallen into place. But in those first months or even year of that, when it was unsettled for you, that had to be a little scary, right?
It totally was. And I think I found myself in that year. So yes, you tell this story. It's like, oh, that's beautiful, really polished. And then there's all of the grief and the weeping and the loss and the joy. And even as we drove away from our brownstone in Brooklyn, and just all of us, we have 4 kids, and we all just wept and wailed. Like we did not hold back. And it was like this moment that like marks you forever, but like, how crazy is that grief and gratitude can go hand in hand? And in that moment, it was like there was grief with letting go and there was joy with what we were driving towards. But then we land in the new land, if you will, and start stepping into what God has for us. And I think for me, it was unsettling, but it was unsettling because I didn't have as much to do. And so I found myself repenting a lot of my identity being attached to my doing, which you tell people don't do that. And then you do it and you're like, yeah. And there's just a lot of letting go. And probably one of my favorite chapters in the book, it's an intense chapter, but it's called The Need to Grieve. And that chapter hit me because not only did I start writing this book on the first day of my firstborn son's senior year, realizing we were pre-grieving his loss, like that everything was about to change for our family, I didn't realize how much I needed to grieve. So there was a lot of repenting, a lot of grieving, and a lot of asking God, okay, what do you want me to build? What do you want me to put my hand to? What things do I leave on the ground and what things do I pick back up? So that is a big, broad brush picture of a lot of the feelings and things that I had to walk through and work through in that first, 6 months to a year.
Get my listener kind of picturing where they are or where they've been or what might be coming. I wanted to walk through the types of change. So there can be the wanted and the planned change. You have a career shift that you want to make, or a move to a different city that you are planning, or a marriage, just something that you're excited about.
Yeah.
Then there's kind of the inevitable. You said your son has been launched into the world. My daughter will go into her senior year, my oldest, this fall. Yeah.
Oh.
We're all aging, like that's happening. And then there's the unwanted and unplanned change, like a job loss or a diagnosis, or even learning of a betrayal that kind of alters everything.
Yeah.
So just, being able to like picture where I am, what I've been through, and then what could be coming. But you say change is constant. And if I've learned anything along the path of life, it's that change and transition can be wonderful teachers.
Mhm.
shaping and molding us into the likeness of Christ. So talk to me about that relationship between change and growth. And then how does
Mhm.
that mold us into Christ likeness?
Yeah, it was one of those years, and it was gosh, what year was that? I think it was actually 2017, where I was grumbling and complaining. I was in one of those places where my husband's mother had just passed away from an inoperable brain tumor. My parents, who had moved with us to New York City to pastor and plant the church, like come alongside us after 8 years of being with us, felt like their season was up. And so I didn't realize until I recognized that I was in transition, which came out with a fight with the washing machine, which is a whole hilarious story that I don't have time to tell, or we can go back into. But either way, my anger was coming back up. I was self-protecting, and I was angry at a washing machine for not working properly. And the Lord just said to me, this isn't that. This isn't about the washing machine. Like, you are in a major transition, and I want to show you that I can be your father. I know you're losing your support network. I know you feel alone. I know you feel rejected, but that's just not true. And so it was like in this moment, I jumped up on that washing machine and I just started sobbing.
Mm.
And through that season, the Lord just showed me, He said, transition can be a teacher or it can take you out. You can either like walk into bitterness, rejection, fear, anger, or you can channel those things and go into the presence of God and allow Him to cause you to become more like Christ. And I think for me, that was after I was reading the end of the Sermon on the Mount, which is like one of the greatest fundamental kingdom changes that we see going, Jesus basically ushering the New Testament out of the old covenant into the new. And at the very end, He says, listen, if you hear my words and actually do them, you are building your life on a rock. So when the storms come, when the winds come, like all of these things are promised, change, storms, all of these things are promised. You'll be okay because you're building your life on me, on the rock. But if you listen to my words and don't do them, it's almost like well, good luck. That's when things start crashing down. So I think we all have seasons where we're like, well, I didn't build that on Jesus. Like, I definitely built that on my own thing, because things come crashing down in our lives sometimes. And so it's recognizing those things and going, God, I want to learn. I want to grow in wisdom. I want to become more like you. And so I think it's having a posture of teachability in seasons of loss and change and transition, but realizing that you actually need to be kind to yourself and possibly grieve, possibly take some time to recover, possibly figure out some new rhythms. So it's a tension that we have to walk in. But those are the ways where change has the potential to take us out or cause us to just become softened and more like Christ. But we do kind of get to choose.
And when you're in those moments, I feel like a really good practice is to look back and see like,
Oh,
oh, He was faithful then in that
yes.
unsettling moment or that transition. And I know He will be now, even though it doesn't feel like it right this minute.
Mm-hmm. There is like a story that I tell in this too, where I'm like incredibly hard on myself. I'm better now, but like that's one thing I work on. But I'm like I don't want to do anything wrong. I'm like, I want to repent. I want to have a soft heart. And I just remember being really hard on myself and sitting with my husband having this conversation. He said, you just need to be kind to yourself. And he goes, hey, we're not where we want to be, but we're not where we used to be. Mm-hmm. And you're right. I think we do have to get good at looking back at the faithfulness of God and seeing how much we have grown instead of being hard on ourselves in the middle of loss or change. Or like you said, some of these are changes we ask for. Marriage, babies, all these things. But then you're like, this is very complicated. It's more complicated than I thought,
All right. Well, we just touched on this a little bit, but let's dig a little deeper into the consequences of avoiding change versus welcoming it.
Yeah, I think that a lot of times, what is it, James 1, where it says, count it all joy, brothers and sisters, when you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith will produce perseverance, and perseverance, once it's finished its work, will cause you to become mature and complete, not lacking anything. I always laugh at that because I'm like, that's just kind of rude. Like, that just speaks to, like, I don't like the scripture, God, on several levels. First of all, that there's testing of our faith. And so like, think about how we avoid tests. maybe some of you are listening going, that's not true. I'm really good at tests. And I always get straight A's. So, but for me, I was a test avoider. But if you avoid tests in the spiritual, things that maybe rock your faith or cause you to go, oh God, I never thought I would be here, is everything that I read, everything that I hear of you, Jesus, is this still true in my situation of shocking loss or betrayal? Is this still true when my faith is tested in the waters of pain or trial or transition that I never saw coming? And those are the moments where when our faith is tested, what does it say? By the testing of our faith, that's when we choose to persevere. It's like, okay, this is being tested in me, but I'm going to keep showing up. I'm going to keep doing the things that are the basics, because when that perseverance finishes its work and we don't avoid the test, that's when we become mature and complete, not lacking anything. But when we avoid the test, when we avoid the change, when we avoid the transition that's inevitable, or the Lord's like, hey, can you do this? And we're like, give me a new word, God. I want a different word. Mm-hmm. Here's what I find is that in the next season, the same test is going to come up again. So you might as well sit the test. You might as well learn the lesson. You might as well grow from it. You might as well dig deep and not avoid it, even though we want to.
I was in Zechariah this morning, and in chapter 13, he talks about refining by fire. So just what you're talking about.
Oh, we read the scripture, but then when it happens, we're like, no, another
he said
way.
This would happen, but I don't want it to.
Yeah, totally.
In chapter 7, you talk about choosing integrity during change and transition. How do we do that?
Oh, that's a good one. This has been one of those things where there's so much to this chapter, and it is one of my favorite chapters, because I think a lot of times what we do in change is think about this. If God asks you to take another job, if God asks you to lay down this season and step into a new one and move maybe to a new city or a new state, and you're like, no, God, I don't want to do this. But once you realize that, hey, this is so clear that we need to be obedient to it. A lot of times what we do in change in our flesh is we want to run a PR campaign as to why we're doing what we're doing instead of walking just in obedience to God. And I think about how like social media and the ability to watch each other's lives has caused us to feel like we have to justify what we're doing before God. When if God is asking you to be obedient and make a change, if God is asking you to move, our obedience is success in his eyes. And so I think too, I break down a lot in this chapter, and I think for me, it came out of this conversation with one of my really good friends, Irene, and she's a emotional intelligence coach, which is crazy. And so we were just talking about how do you actually process your change with integrity? And so do you mind if I just give a couple of things here?
No, please do.
Okay. So that's not only when it comes to not justifying yourself. That's not the only part of integrity. There's a lot more about processing your change with integrity before God and before others. So think about the fact that there's always pain in change. Even in the good change, there's pain because you lose different things and your life changes. So there's pain and loss. But how it lands on us, we have to pay attention to how it lands on us due to varying factors of, our family of origin or things that we've walked through, because how we're going to process that change has to do with how we've processed it in the past. So what we have to do is we need to pay attention to the pain. Don't avoid pain while you're walking through change. Pay attention to it and where it's coming up. So what we have to do is we have to feel it and process it. Otherwise, it will just keep coming up. And this is why the grief chapter is important. And then we often have to ask the question too, what's beneath the hurt? Why do I feel pain in this change? Is it betrayal? Is it because I thought my life was going to look a lot different than it does, God? And I'm a little bit angry with you and we need to have a conversation. I need to repent of that and ask for forgiveness. So once you ask yourself what's beneath that, ask yourself too, am I believing a lie? Am I believing a script that narrates an untrue story over and over again that lacks integrity? Because that usually, when we believe a lie and play a script in our mind, is when we begin to bear false witness against another, because we feel like we have to justify ourselves for the change that we're making. So this is why we have to do the work on our end and pay attention to those things and process and walk in forgiveness. And we also, I think this is a really big one because this is the difference between there's the world's justice and God's justice. And man, don't we want like to be justified before man?
Me too.
We do. We want people to pat us on the back and say, good job. But our justification comes from the Lord. And that can be really hard when, especially if it's been a painful shift or change. So that's where we have to be careful to not vilify somebody else as we're walking through change. We need to process the pain with integrity before God, because endings, transitions, changes, they're all opportunities to learn and grow. And so I think, this is a big one too. And this came out of pastoring, for years and years, was I would watch people really flourish. And this is true for my heart too, when they would take ownership of what they could take ownership of. And that's how you can have integrity and change. You cannot, isn't this hard? You can't control what anybody else is going to do. I still hate that. This is true.
I tell my kids that.
I know. But I think that that's what you have to realize. You will grow and flourish as you continue to take ownership of what you can take ownership of and release the other people in the scenario to God and walk with integrity and take the higher road, even when you want to take the lower road and throw people under the bus. So that is just a few things on how we can have integrity and change.
Those are very wise, Andi. Thank you for sharing those with us. You have written another book on friendship. We here are all about community and just needing those relationships, continuing the conversation. So I want to know how friendship or community has helped you through some of your transitions.
That is the best question. It's so crazy. I would say in this transition, I have never experienced community like this in my whole life. And I have found a safety and a healing that I didn't even really believe I could have. It's crazy because I did write this whole book about friendship. It's complicated. And really, the first part of that is about walking and healing yourself to show up healthy at the table and then having intentional connection. And once I stepped out of being a lead pastor and then basically am now a part of a church and under authority, it was like a whole new world for me to make friendships. And I just didn't even realize how much being in a pastoral role, there were people that wanted something from me for what I could give or have or do or say, where that just totally went out the window. And I was like, this is quite possibly the most beautiful season of friendship I've ever been in. Like truly, truly. And so for me, I have had friends in this place, and my pastor here, Pastor Lisa, but she's also one of my closest friends. I'm the one that gets to wear the right hat, know what conversation we're having. But with her, I've just never been so pastored and loved and seen. And then also had a friend who stuck closer to me when I was grieving and in pain and didn't push me away and wasn't like, oh, you don't want to be here, but it was like, come close. It's okay to feel deeply. And so I think for me, it has been a practice for me to not try to find a doorway out, but to find a doorway in and to go first and move in and be vulnerable with the small group of people. So be authentic with the many, vulnerable with the few. Not everybody gets to have everything, but those few, and I just happened to meet with them this morning, are the greatest treasure. And so if you are broken, if you're listening to this and you struggle in friendships and relationships, if you have been isolated or alone, I'm just praying and believing that this will be a season where God will bring healing, but also a friend, because it changes the game when you walk through any form of loss or change, whether that is, again, a good one, like getting married or having a baby. You still need people in your world.
Yes, you do.
Helping you. So yes, it's been pivotal and vital and key in this transition. Yeah.
There is a question that I ask all my guests, which is, what are your favorite 5? What are you reading or eating or watching that are your favorite things?
Ooh, I love it. I love it. I love it. So, what am I? So, our whole family right now is watching Young Sheldon together, which is like, I don't even know how this happened, but it's been like the sweetest little show for our family to have some downtime together. What am I reading? I have been reading a few different books, but I've been reading The Way of the Victorious by Parker Green. He's my brother, but it's actually one of the best discipleship books on spiritual disciplines that I've ever read. Simple, convicting, and practical. I've been reading that. And then I actually, gosh, I have also finished watching All the Light We Cannot See. I'm a World War II novel, like historical fiction genre person. So I watched the Netflix series and bawled my eyes out because the book was beautiful. And then also Newly is a rental clothing company. Have you heard of Newly before?
No, please
No.
share.
So I will share. It's very fun. So I found this moving here. A few of my friends did. I was like, why do you guys always have cute clothes? I'm like wearing the same jeans and top all the time because, and then I preach and teach all over, and then you're photographed, and I'm like, wow, I'm wearing the same thing everywhere I go. Well, basically, what Newly is this clothing rental company. I guess it's kind of like Rent the Runway, but more like Anthropology, Free People, those sorts of clothing brands.
You get on board with that?
Yeah, and you rent basically every month. You can pause whenever you want. So if you only want to rent 2 times a year, you can, but you basically pay $85 to $90 for 7 pieces of clothing per month, and you wear them as much as you want. Sometimes they're brand new, sometimes they're lightly used. And if you love something, you can keep it. But at the end of the month, you send it back, and you usually get it for a pretty good discount.
That was my next question. What if you love it? Can you keep it?
You can keep it. So you can
cool.
you can purchase it. So, and then if you're not sure, you can just rent it again and rent it again and rent it again. If you're like, I don't know if I want to buy it, but I realized instead of going to a store every single time I have a travel season and buying a new blazer or a new top or a new pair of jeans, which is $100 for the jeans or just under that, and a blazer can be like $80. And it's like, I'm spending less wearing rental and pausing it whenever I don't need it. So Newly is a favorite. And then one last thing would be, what am I eating? Well, we just made Mexican lasagna, which is one of our favorite things to make, which is basically enchiladas, but you just layer them instead of rolling them all up. And then you put all the toppings on top. But
it's less work.
We have that a lot, and it's really good.
Those are terrific. That is awesome that your brother is also an author.
Yeah, he's amazing. Straight shooter. Pretty but this book is like, oh, I feel very convicted reading all of this stuff. I grew up
good,
with him,
and also uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah. So good.
All right. What are your last words for us, Andi? We're going to go through change. We're going through change right now. It's coming. We've been through it. How can you encourage us as we are in this season of change?
Yeah. I would say to many of you, whatever you are doing, if you've just had that newborn baby and you prayed for this miracle and now you are exhausted and you feel yourself getting angry or being hard on yourself or not looking like the social media mother you thought you would be, or if you just got married and you're like, I did not know all these issues were going to come up to the surface in my heart, like as the two became one. Or if you have a new job or you've just went through incredible loss, the biggest thing I can say is be kind to yourself, pay attention to your rhythm and what God wants to do in this season. I think a lot of times we're too hard on ourselves in change, but we are constantly in motion and we are growing and we are changing. So just take a deep breath wherever you are, be present, and thank God, again, what we talked about kind of at the start, for how far you have come, and then trust God where He's leading you, and you're going to be okay.
Those are beautiful last words to end on. This conversation has been so fun, even though it is surrounding a topic that is not always fun. I appreciate that you followed in obedience and wrote a book on change.
Thank you. I'm grateful that I got to. And I'm giggling, going, either no one's going to want to buy this thing or it's going to help a lot of people.
I vote number 2.
Okay, great.
Andi, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening. This conversation with Andi was so fun and also convicting. It made me pause and think about how I handle change, even the good kind. I love how she pointed out that in planned change, the change we want, there are things we're likely laying down, and it's okay to notice and to grieve those losses even as we're looking forward to what's ahead. I also really appreciated Andi walking us through processing change with integrity, because we get to choose. All the ways to connect with Andi are in the show notes for this episode. Grab a copy of her book, Braving Change, and tune into her podcast, Coffee with Andi. If you're not already a GTL newsletter subscriber, sign up now to be in the running for a copy of her book that I will give away later this week. And don't forget, as a birthday gift to me, please leave a rating or review to support the show. Don't let change take you out, friend. Let's have a posture of teachability and transition. And of course, don't let the conversation stop when the show is over. Share your story and start your own conversations with the girls in your life. I will see you back here in just a few weeks. Thanks for tuning in.